This episode contains the recounting of traumatic events, kidnapping, horrific violence, and sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised. Joanne Berry was driving home from lunch at her mother's house when a man jumped in front of her moving vehicle. He was being chased. The man suddenly opened the back door of her Tarago van and crawled into the back seat alongside her 4 children. Joanne yelled at him to get out, but British backpacker Paul Onions wasn't going anywhere. Sensing his fear, Joanne turned her car around and headed for the nearest police station. As she looked in the rearview mirror, she saw the man who had been chasing Paul, sneering. They didn't know it then, but Paul and Joanne had just escaped a man who would become one of the most notorious serial killers in Australia, Ivan Milat. I'm Jessie Stephens, and this is True Crime Conversations, exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, we'll take a look at the life of Ivan Milat to get inside the mind of one of our country's worst serial killers. Joining me for this episode is journalist and author Mark Whittaker, who co-wrote the definitive story of Ivan Milat titled Sins of the Brother. We begin with a summer's day in 1990. I want to start in January 1990. A British backpacker named Paul Onions, he's in his early 20s, wants to hitchhike out of Sydney, and he meets a road worker called Bill, and then he jumps in the passenger seat. Can you talk us through what then unfolds in the following hours or so?
Yeah, well, they just start talking as you do when you're hitchhiking. You feel like as a hitchhiker you have to provide some value to the person who's picked you up. I've done a bit of hitchhiking myself. And Paul found himself being asked a lot of questions by Bill about where he was headed, who was expecting him there, whether he had a timetable. Paul mentioned that he'd been in the Navy. He was recently discharged, and everything was going along quite well until suddenly, as they reached Mittagong in the New South Wales Southern Highlands, about an hour into the drive, Paul started to notice a bit of a change in Bill's personality. And then he asked Paul if he had special forces training. Things like that started to not sound right. He went on a bit of a racist rant, and the mood had just changed, and Paul found himself starting to get paranoid. And, he's battling these dual thoughts, you're just being paranoid, mate, just settle down, combined with, why is he asking me all these questions? And it came to a head when Bill pulled over and declared that they were losing radio reception and he had to go and get some tapes out of the boot. But Paul looked down into the console between their seats and there were a whole bunch of tapes there. So he's thinking, this isn't right. He got out to sort of have a look and stretch his legs, and Bill told him, get back in there, and was strangely cranky with him. So, his alarm bells are totally ringing, but at the same time he's telling himself he's being paranoid. So he gets back in the car, puts his seatbelt on, and is really relieved when Bill gets back in the car and puts his seatbelt back on as well. Thinks, no, it's all right, you're just being paranoid. But then seconds later, Bill's out again, saying, just going to look for a few things under the seat. And he rifles under the driver's seat, pulls out a revolver and says, this is a robbery. And Paul is just, you can't imagine what that would feel like. But he does what he's told and he stays there. And then Bill rifles around some more underneath the seat and pulls out some ropes. And that's what really set him off. Suddenly Paul realises, this isn't a robbery. I'm just a poxy backpacker with a dirty old rucksack. He doesn't want to rob me. And so he has that moment of clarity where he basically says, he says to himself, well, you're going to have to shoot me because I'm not staying here. takes the seatbelt off, opens the door and does a runner. He tries to flag down a few cars. Bill chases him, fires a shot, misses him, even though he's quite a good shot. So I suspect he probably didn't want to shoot him there with cars going by. They wrestled. Paul got away with a ripped shirt. And you've got to bear in mind, Ivan Milat was the first Australian Paul Onions had ever met, had ever got talking to. He'd only been in the country a few weeks, but he was just hanging around Bondi with a whole lot of other backpackers. This was the first four-wheel drive he'd ever been in, the first car with a bull bar he'd ever been in. His first glimpse of Australian bush as they just got out of the edge of Sydney. He had no idea where he was or the scale of the place. He's out there on the side of this road, no houses in sight. He doesn't know where he is. He thinks, I'm gone. There's a guy with a gun who wants him. And there weren't many cars going past, and the few that had just gone past him and not stopped. And eventually he says, well, I'm just going to run in front of the next one, and they're either going to run over me or I'm going to stop them, because it was his last chance. And that's what he did. The car stopped. The woman driving it had a car full of kids and her mother in the car. She didn't want to stop. She told him to get out. He opened the door and just dived in and said, I'm not going anywhere. He's got a gun, please. He saw her sort of soften, and she spoke to her mother, and he heard the words police station, and suddenly they were reversing, then edging across the bush in the median strip, and she bush-bashed across the freeway to get into the other lane as they saw Bill walking back to his car with his hands sort of strangely beside his side like he was carrying something, a air gun. The thing to note is when that happened, 5 kilometres directly in front of them as they went across that median strip, the bodies of Deborah Everest and James Gibson were lying there. They'd only been dead for 3.5 weeks. They were Ivan Milat's first known victims, but they'd barely been notified as missing people at that point.
It was Mrs. Joanne Berry who rescued Paul. She was driving to Canberra with his sister and their 5 children on board.
If I hadn't stopped, he would have joined the others in the forest.
Or you'd have run him over.
Yeah. Yeah.
When he got to the police station, what did he remember about what this man looked like and any distinctive features?
He remembered quite a lot. He remembered that he had a Dennis Lilly Merv Hughes type moustache. He said his name was Bill. He was a road worker. He was of Yugoslav extraction. He remembered the sheepskin seat covers, that he came from the Liverpool area. So there was a bit of detail, but by no means enough for any police investigating to have a chance of being able to track him down.
What I want to do now is sort of go back to about 1944 when Ivan was born, and he's born into this family that would become massive. What do we know about what kind of world he was born into and that sort of thing?
Well, Ivan was the 5th of what would become 14 children. Their circumstances were somewhat poor. Their father was an extremely hard-working, strict disciplinarian type. As soon after Ivan was born, they took up land and became market gardeners at Moorebank in Sydney's southwest. And all those earlier children really knew hard work, and they worked with their father growing the tomatoes, and they had an austere but by no means unexceptional lifestyle. Their house may have had a rammed earth floor, but that sort of thing wasn't so uncommon. Living across the river from them, just a kilometre or two away, there were 3,000 people living in ex-army Nissen huts, because there was just a lot of people without homes at that point in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And their poverty didn't stand out so much. By the time we get to 1970 and they're still living in those circumstances, they're starting to look a bit different. The suburbs are sort of encroaching around them. The market garden has long since ceased to operate, and a lot of those younger brothers that were born grew up in more the 60s, the loose living, they started to smoke drugs and get into trouble.
Bill Newell, the local cop, remembers arresting Ivan Milat for his first offence as an adult, the robbery of a local club in 1962.
He'd go there, Mrs. Milat would front the door and say, he's not here, I don't know where he is. She'd tell me.
and we went past her and we went into the bedroom, and Ivan's hiding under a bed in the far corner of the room, and pulled him out from under the bed, and I said to him, "What are you doing there?" He said, "I'm looking for my shoes."
Now, Ivan got into trouble with them too. He was perhaps the ringleader, from stealing safes to stealing cars and breaking into stores at the army barracks. He had a string of petty offences, petty convictions, and did time in various juvenile institutions where he was exposed to Lord knows what. But you can imagine that in the 1960s it wouldn't have been good what he was exposed to. But yes, he was certainly in that environment, that very harsh situation where that changes people. And he later went to Grafton Prison, which was the most notorious prison of its era, where prisoners were routinely bashed and humiliated to quite an extreme degree, so much so that they had a royal commission about it and it was closed down. But yeah, he spent a year or so in there. So he's been dehumanised to quite an extent by the system.
And so that was him as still a young man, right? Because he spent his 18th birthday in prison or in juvenile detention?
Yeah, that sounds right. I think about half of his teenage years were spent in institutions. So, yeah, he didn't have a normal upbringing.
Yeah. And so he has all of these brothers as well. What was the reputation of the family? Were they known for being kind of rule breakers, and were they sort of unpopular in that community?
They were insular. They didn't really hang out with a lot of other people. They were perhaps not feared individually, but nobody was going to take them on, because you knew if you took one on, you had to take them all on. Even if one brother was feuding with another, they'd still back each other up against the world. And they were often, people wouldn't remember them as individuals, just as this amorphous kind of thing, quite powerful in their own sort of way and scary.
And were his other brothers getting in trouble sort of criminally as well? Were they on the police radar?
To my knowledge, most of the brothers did come into contact with the law,
right,
with the possible exception of the oldest, Alex. But yeah, most of them had encounters, and more than one usually, but most of them appeared to have come to their senses and to a large extent lived very clean, reputable lives since that period, since their wild youth. And Ivan too. He spent most of his life without getting into trouble. Was a hard-working, apparently upstanding citizen once we get to the mid-70s.
Mm. In terms of his relationship with his brother Boris, that was one of the more unusual kind of sibling relationships in that family, in that Boris then finds a woman named Marilyn, who he's in a relationship with. What then happened between Marilyn and Ivan?
Well, Marilyn found herself increasingly being attracted to Ivan. He seemed gentler, kinder, and just altogether more together than Boris. Boris is Ivan's immediate next oldest brother, and they got up to a bit of trouble together and were pretty good mates up to this time. But when Boris started noticing Ivan and Marilyn paying a bit too much attention to each other, things soured, and certainly Marilyn told us that by that period, around 1965, 66, they were having a full-blown affair. And it certainly appears possible that one of Ivan's conviction might have been caused by Boris dobbing him into the cops right around the time that Marilyn's daughter, Lenice, was conceived. Boris raised Lenice as his own daughter, but pretty much everybody in the family recognises that she is in fact Ivan's daughter. Ivan got sent away to jail for a couple of years for that offence that Boris may have dobbed him in for. Boris and Marilyn continued together for quite some years, but they had a terribly stormy relationship that was never happy.
In what way was it stormy?
Boris admits that he was full of rage, basically, and that Lenice tells us that her strongest memories of childhood are like hearing Mum and Dad going off again and her racing down the stairs and pulling Dad off Mum, and just she was quite bitter towards childhood that she felt she never had because of all these problems.
And so what ended up happening with Marilyn and Ivan? Did they sort of continue seeing each other?
He got out of prison, I think somewhere in 1969, and they resumed their relationship, again undercover. Boris was terribly paranoid, but it looks like they still managed to keep something going undercover until eventually, around about the end of 1970, early 71, she broke it off. She could see it was going nowhere. She married Boris by that time, and it was over. Ivan appears to have reacted to that by his first known sexual-related offence. He found two hitchhikers at Liverpool Station heading to Melbourne and picked them up and gave them a lift late one afternoon. When they got somewhere down towards Goulburn, so it's about 2 hours drive south of Liverpool, he stopped the car and said, basically demanded sex. Reading their accounts, it's a bit hard to exactly get your head around, but eventually, after perhaps even an hour of trying to negotiate their way out of this, Ivan has pulled out two knives and said, either one of you have sex with me or I'm going to kill you. The negotiations continued until one of them eventually said, if I have sex with you, will you let us go? And they had sex in the car with Ivan staring at the other friend in the back seat, telling her not to look. And it was over quite quickly. And then one of them said, we've done you a favour. Can you do us a favour and take us to get a drink? So he took them into Goulburn, meanwhile suggesting, how about you and I spend a week together in Melbourne? No, thank you, they said. And at the service station in Goulburn, they eventually raised the alarm and people came out and surrounded the car. Ivan fled up the highway, where he was arrested soon after by police and charged with rape.
What do you think his plan was? Because going to a service station with two women, one of whom you've just raped, it just doesn't seem like he had any sort of understanding of what the consequences might be. Yeah, absolutely. But, you can perhaps see that he's taken away a message from that. To our knowledge, no one else survived after that. He didn't do the same thing again. Although, interestingly, he did pull out some ropes during the course of these negotiations with the girls. And one of them mentioned the ropes, and he said, yeah, I always come prepared, strongly indicating that this wasn't the first time he'd done such a thing. Because that's in 1971 that happens. And we can look back with the, benefit of hindsight and think, hang on, if this man had been caught, which he was, the police then found him, if he'd been put away for a crime like that, then perhaps what happened in the years following could have been avoided. Why is it? How did it come to be that 20 years later we're finding bodies in Belangolo State Forest? What went wrong in terms of the investigation and the possible conviction of Milat when it comes to those two girls?
Well, he got bail and skipped bail and disappeared for 2.5 years until Boris dobbed him in again. They arrested him by his mum's hospital bed in 1974. However, Milat's lawyer got up in court and he honed in on the girls' sexuality. This is 1971 we're talking about, where they'd met in a mental institution where they were being treated because they were just two girls trying to figure out, who they were and which way they were orientated. But in those days, that was seen as a mental illness. Well,
homosexuality was still illegal, wasn't it?
Yes, the homosexual acts were illegal, yes. And John Marsden, the lawyer, who was himself gay, he honed in on this. He'd seen them at Ruby Red's, a nightclub, just prior to the court case there. So that's how he got wind of their sexuality, and he wasn't afraid to play on that to the jury. And, of course, with all the convoluted negotiations, they were able to make it look as though there was actually consent, which, of course, is an absolute absurdity. When you tell somebody that you have sex with me, I'm going to kill you. But, yeah, the jury came back and said, not guilty. Different times.
Yeah, absolutely.
One would imagine it wouldn't happen now. Having said that, I also don't think that a guilty verdict would have done that much to have averted anything that followed, because I've got no idea how long he might have served, but he certainly would have been well and truly out by the time that the backpackers started disappearing.
That's a good point. So it was about 20 years later that a discovery was made by two runners who were sort of orienteering in Belangolo State Forest. What did they see that day? Because that sort of changed everything in terms of searching that forest.
Well, they didn't see too much, but they smelt something and went over. There's a large boulder, an enormous rock, and it had a bit of a half a cave, sort of an indentation around the base of it. And they could see a human leg protruding out of some sticks that were piled in there, a boot. And they then called the police, and that's what they saw. Carolyn Clark's body was found about 30 metres away, again under a pile of sticks. When that was examined by the forensic pathologist, what he saw was the Welsh girl, Joanne Walters. She'd been the victim of an incredible fury, a large knife that was wielded so strongly that it cut through ribs and it cut through the spine. We're not talking breaking these bones. You can actually see clean marks where it's just sliced gouges out of these bones.
So did it look like a knife was the murder weapon?
Yes. On Joanne Walters, there was no evidence of any other injury, but multiple knife wounds focused around the back and through the chest, through the back of the chest and the spine. With Carolyn Clark, it was completely different. Her head was covered in a shirt and she was shot with several neat groupings of bullets, and they could see that from where the casings were that all 10 bullets had been fired from exactly the same spot. But in order for that to work with the head, the killer has fired 3 or 4 bullets, got up, moved her head, gone back, fired 3 or 4 more, got up, moved her head again to a different angle and shot 3 or 4 more, 10 bullets in total, all from the same spot.
So is that unusual for, you've got these two victims who have been murdered and their bodies have been found, but murdered in two very different ways. Is that uncommon when it comes to these sorts of cases?
Certainly the forensic psychiatrist, Rod Milton, who looked at it and who went to the scene, he thought 2 people were involved, that this definitely looked like separate personalities. And if it was the same person, well, perhaps it could be argued they were displaying different sides of their personality in the 2 scenes, but he thought that unlikely and that it appeared to be 2 people. And he speculated then in his report to the police that it would most likely be brothers.
So those 2 women, Caroline and Joanne, how long had they been missing, and were their parents looking for them? Was there concern about where they'd gone? Because they were both tourists, right?
They were. They'd been having a cracking good time in Australia. They'd hitchhiked up and down the Hume numerous times through the Riverina to go grape picking down to Melbourne. They'd crossed over to Tasmania, hitched a bit around there, come back to Sydney. They were heading back to the Riverina to do some more fruit picking when they eventually disappeared, Easter 1992. They were the last victims to disappear and also the first to be found. And Joanne Walters' parents were in Australia trying to generate publicity, get the search happening. They'd been here for quite some time when the bodies were found, about, I think, 4 or 5 months after they disappeared.
And what did the police originally suspect had happened to them? Did they think they were runaways or something? I mean, what do you do as, the police at that stage when there's no record of these people? Is it common for people to sort of just disappear off the grid a little bit?
Well, I think in the very early days that was what was suspected, but the longer those things go on, the more that expression, police hold grave fears for the safety of them, the more that came into play. But yeah, there's not a lot you can do because there's so little to go on. Even with the benefit of hindsight, it's really hard to imagine what more police could have done. Where do you even start? And there was a connection to be made on the very weekend that they disappeared, Easter 1992. The Neugebauers, a German family, were in Australia canvassing backpackers around King's Cross looking for their son and his girlfriend, Anya Habsheed. And, it's feasible that they may have even walked past each other, these German parents, showing pictures of their son and his girlfriend at the backpacker saying, have you seen our kids? Clark and Walters were in King's Cross that day and left the following morning, probably caught a train to Liverpool and then pitched from there.
Wow.
Never to be seen again.
Because within 12 months in that, same location, 5 more bodies were found, so 7 in total. And the last 2 bodies were Anja Habschied and Neugebauer?
Gabor Neugebauer.
Returning now to the day's top report, the discovery of 2 more backpacker murder victims in the Belanglo State Forest near Bowral. The bodies are believed to be those of German tourists Gabor Neugebauer and his 19-year-old girlfriend Anja Habschied. They're the 6th and 7th murder victims to be uncovered in the forest. Their bodies were found during a police line search of thick bushland, only a kilometre east of the spot where Simone Schmidl's body was found on Monday. Like the others, at least one of these bodies was carefully covered with branches, dirt and leaves.
What are police thinking at this point? Are they sure that all of these murders are related? Because they do have a few things in common, but then again, there are sort of those differences that we talked about in terms of the 2 different methods.
It was only right at the end of the bodies turning up that the police actually admitted that they were all connected, that they were looking for a serial killer or killers. And just going back, the first people to disappear, Everest and Gibson, the Australian couple, they both had exhibited the same knife fury that Joanne Walters' body showed. So they'd both been killed by this very angry, strong, knife-wielding person. The next victim killed was Simone Schmidl, also from Germany. She too was killed by somebody wielding a knife very powerfully. The next victims to disappear were Neugebauer and Habschied, and it led to a lot of speculation how one person could possibly subdue them, because Gabor Neugebauer was 6'4" and lifted weights. He was a big unit, and so that led to speculation that you'd need 2 people. Though a man with a gun does wield an awful lot of power. Curiously, in the days after they disappeared, Ivan Milat went to his neighbour, who was a bit of a panel beater, and got him to fix a bullet hole in the door of his car. It was in the front passenger door, about thigh height, indicating that Neugebauer may well have been shot in the leg, or at least a warning shot fired at him in the front passenger seat. Gabor's body was later found with, I think, 4 bullet wounds to the head, and he had a broken bone in his throat, indicating the possibility of strangulation. So suddenly we have a slightly different scene there, but his girlfriend, Anja Habschied, her death was slightly different again. The only visible wound to her was, decapitation, and her head was never found. There was also evidence of bondage devices attached to her jeans, found several hundred metres away from her body. So that gives rise to all sorts of speculation about what she may have suffered.
Was there any indication that these murders were sexually motivated? Because obviously there were male and female victims, but the females were often found in slightly different ways in terms of their clothing and stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, right from the start there was evidence of a sexual nature, but as Rod Milton, the psychiatrist, said, while sex played a part in the thinking of this perpetrator, it wasn't central to it. Both the male victims had their flies undone. Most of the female victims had their bras in a pushed-up kind of position. I think Joanne Walters has also had a fly undone, but the button done up, as though if anything had happened there, she'd had time to pull her trousers back up perhaps before the murder actually began. So there was all those sort of clues as to the nature of it, but certainly the psychiatrist thought that this was more about the power, the death, than about the sex, although the sex was in the mix towards the males and the females.
So that psychologist was putting together a bit of a profile about what this person, or two people potentially, might look like or be motivated by, or what their career might look like. What were they guessing about the person responsible for this?
My memory's a bit hazy on this, but it was that there'd be two brothers, that the younger of the brothers would be the stabber, that he would be disordered and would have had a problematic life, in and out of employment. The older brother was the shooter, was more together and was probably the leader. He suggested they would have lived together, probably out on the fringes of society somewhere, on a block, in a caravan, isolated from their community, and they wouldn't have taken part in community sort of activities. So there were certainly elements of it that he got right, you've got to imagine, but elements that were wrong. And, in his report, he says these are just speculations, and it's not gospel. It's not like the TV shows where they give the forensic psychiatrists a ridiculous degree of omniscience. It doesn't work like that.
These bodies were found sort of really deep in this remote area. And so would you therefore assume that the person knew the area? Because if you didn't, surely that would be a risk, because you wouldn't know who was around, or, if there were people going on walks or whatever. So did they think that this person must spend a bit of time in the Belanglo State Park?
Yeah, they definitely thought that they were dealing with a local who was familiar with the area. How local was always open to speculation. And it kind of, perhaps the investigation took a bit of a turn when they started thinking of it more as being, hang on, these people left Sydney in the morning and they ended up here. This is somebody leaving home and heading south in the morning. So they started to think, well, maybe someone in the Liverpool area was more likely to have been responsible.
And how far is Belanglo from sort of the centre of Sydney?
Oh, these days with the freeway, on a good day you could be there in under 2 hours. Probably took a little bit longer then.
And the actual
battling the traffic
park itself, what does it look like? Is it sort of dense bushland, or is it used for recreational activities as well?
You drive in and go past a bit of farmland, and then you're hit by pine forests, just rows and rows of dead straight trees, and it's all quite dead in terms of life. And you drive through that for a while, and then you hit just fairly bland, scrubby Australian bush, open kind of forest that quite unremarkable, shorter, stunted eucalypts. There's nothing that would make you go bushwalking there or something. It's not that interesting, but it's popular with people who want to go shooting. Obviously, the Orienteers use it. The Barrel Pistol Club has a range in there somewhere. So, as the searches were going on in the forest, the sound of gunfire was a regular background noise, just to weird it out a bit more. Lots of groups that just need an available patch of bush to do something, use it.
The victims found so far have been featured widely in newspapers. We've had the police have had a fair idea of who they're looking for. The one thing we don't know, it's been suggested there could be more than a dozen hitchhikers missing along the Hume Highway, heading south or west or going to other states. They're not frequently in touch with relatives. It's possible that the families, with what's going on here in the forest, may make contact with the police and remind them that certain people haven't come home, and that may open up new investigations.
OK, thanks, Harry. Harry Potter keeping us up to date with the backpacker murders in the Belanglo State Forest.
So these bodies have been found in, at this point, it's turned into a bit of a media frenzy, because these 7 people who are now being identified have been discovered, and they obviously don't know who's responsible. And that starts reaching the other side of the world, and Paul Onions sees it, who it starts sort of ringing a bell. How had he recovered since that incident with Bill? Because he went back to England, or where he was living. Was there any sort of PTSD or struggle that he had after having such a close encounter ultimately with death?
Yeah, he thought he pulled up really well from it, but it was only sort of in hindsight that he told us that he realised he wasn't so well. He remembered going to a U2 concert in Paris and just having this massive anxiety attack in the middle of the crowd, and things like that were starting to affect him. Yeah, so he wasn't handling it that well, and at some point there, I think it was during the time in which the forest was being searched for the second time, when the bulk of the bodies were being uncovered, one of his Australian mates who he'd got a job with after the attack, because he stayed in Australia and kept holidaying, he toughed it out. And this mate of his phoned him in England saying, that thing that happened to you, there's all these bodies turning up in that area. I think you should report it. And he saw something in the British newspapers about it as well. And yes, so eventually he got his act together and rang up the High Commissioner, I think, and they put him onto the task force. They were getting so much information then that it just got buried, disappeared. The computer wasn't working very well, and so it really didn't serve any purpose for quite a few months and just disappeared there until a young copper called Paul Gordon decided that he was very much of this opinion that this was a Liverpool-based problem, and started searching the computer. It didn't really work, so we started going through all the hard copy pieces of paper that had come in, thousands of them, looking for something that jived with this hitchhiking Liverpool. And yeah, eventually he found this report of Paul Onions. However, a lot of people think that Paul Onions cracked the case, whereas that's not really the case, because the case was cracked because this copper, Paul Gordon, was already working on the Milats. And he was working on the Milats because Ivan's younger brother, Richard, had boasted to people he worked with, I know who killed those Germans. Richard was perpetually stoned and drunk, and he'd babble on about all sorts of things. So people didn't pay him an awful lot of attention. They'd go out of their way to try and ignore him. But that comment and a few others, like stabbing a woman is like cutting a loaf of bread, comments like that had stuck in their minds because they were a bit too weird even for him. So they reported him. Ivan's oldest brother, Alex, had also reported seeing two women being driven into Belanglo State Forest at the time of the murders. Alex was a member of the Barrel Pistol Club, and Alex's report was so incredibly detailed, describing all sorts of things. These women, he could describe the colour of the blindfolds, what they were wearing, the tattoos on the guy driving the car, all sorts of things. It made the police from the very beginning think that the story wasn't true. But it went into a file along with Richard Milat's name. And so Paul Gordon was already looking at the Milats. He'd already seen that Richard Milat had an alibi for the Everest and Gibson murders. They'd already looked at Ivan's work record and saw that Ivan didn't have an alibi. Somebody else had rung in and said that Ivan Milat was a gun nut and they should look at him. They had so many of those sort of reports, they were totally useless. But again, it was another time the names had come up. So they were looking at him. And Paul Gordon had been given the job to look at this family. So when he found, and there were 30-40 cops working on the task force, but it was him that went and found Paul Onions' report amongst a pile of other reports. So great working by him. When he found that report, they were eventually able to bring Onions out to Australia, show him the mugshots of Ivan, and I think out of 14 pictures, I think it was 14, Onions picked out Ivan as his attacker.
Why do you think that Alex Milat went to the police and it sounds like falsified a sort of witness report? Do you think that was an attempt to protect Ivan?
Wouldn't I love to know the answer to that? That's one of the great mysteries. There were people who speculated that maybe by giving such a ridiculous, unbelievable report, he was actually trying to draw attention to his family. I don't believe that. Yeah, Alex's other very interesting connection to the case is about a year before Ivan was arrested, Alex moved to Queensland, and when he went, Ivan gave him a present of a backpack, which he carted up to Queensland. So when, in the days before Ivan was arrested, the police went to see Alex, Alex and his wife, pretty much unprompted, mentioned this backpack that Ivan had given them, and so they handed it over. And it turned out to be Simone Schmidl's backpack. And
wow.
So, yeah, it was one of many such nails in Ivan's coffin that really reinforced that he was guilty. Separately, he also had Simone Schmidl's sleeping bag, and that was a type of sleeping bag that was only sold in Germany. You couldn't buy it in Australia. How did Ivan get it? If it was a stitch-up, it was the best stitch-up in history, because there are so many facets of the case like that you couldn't organise it.
Good evening. A 50-year-old man is being questioned tonight in Sydney about the backpacker murders. He was arrested in a huge overnight operation in the Campbelltown area, and since then he's been charged with threatening a hitchhiker in 1990. The arrest led to a new search of the Belanglo State Forest near Bowral.
So then in May 1994, they circle Ivan Milat's house and they're kind of ready to search it for evidence. What kind of evidence do they find in his house?
The first thing they find, curiously, was what they call a breech bolt assembly. I don't understand guns, but I gather that that's just the bit around the firing pin. One of the coppers went up into the roof through the manhole, was pulling pink bats up, and he sawed down one of the wall cavities. That there was something down there, a plastic bag. He got a stick and pulled it up. It was this breech bolt assembly which had a firing pin which exactly matched the very peculiar shape of the firing pin that had fired the bullets that killed Carolyn Clark. So again, if there's a stitch-up, they've had to go out and find a gun that had an uncanny resemblance to that was identical to that which killed Carolyn Clark.
There was a photo, wasn't there, of his girlfriend at the time wearing a T-shirt that sort of rang some alarm bells.
It wasn't a T-shirt. It was like a rugby jersey style top.
Right.
Benetton white with two green horizontal stripes across the midsection. They never found the top. There was just the picture of Ivan's girlfriend, Shalinda Hughes, wearing it. And again, they did the research on that top, and they were only sold in Britain. You couldn't buy them in Australia.
And she didn't have any account for how she got hold of it?
No, I don't think she cooperated with the police, and I don't think they really learned. But, or maybe, I might be doing a disservice there. Maybe she did tell them that he brought it out once when she was cold, and then she never saw it again. Something like that.
And so once they've got all of that evidence, did they get any DNA evidence on Ivan?
No. This was one of the weakest parts of their case. They sent some swabs of hairs found in the hand of Joanne Walters to the lab. They were given to an inexperienced lab technician who stuffed them up basically, and they weren't able to find whose DNA was on those hairs. I think similarly they did a vaginal swab of her, and there was similar stuff-ups with the DNA.
Wow.
So that's one of the very valid points that the people who say Ivan is innocent, one of the points they make, that this reeks of conspiracy, that these DNA samples yielded nothing, that these would have been the crucial information that would have cleared him.
It was standing room only here at Campbelltown Court. Milat sat through the 20-minute hearing emotionless, and he's been charged, of course, with the murder of 3 German backpackers, 2 English backpackers, and 2 Victorians, James Gibson and Deborah Everett. We were told some gruesome details. One of the bodies found, the head had been actually severed. Another head was found with 10 bullets in it. John Marsden, appearing for Milat, denied all the charges and said he would strenuously plead not guilty.
Once he goes to trial and the evidence is presented, which is pretty compelling, what sort of conviction does Milat get?
He was convicted with a never-to-be-released caveat on it, so that he would die in jail.
Do you think, having done all the research that you have and obviously, knowing a bit about Australian criminal history, that he's the worst serial killer that Australia has seen?
I wouldn't care to go into those sort of value judgments. He's certainly among them. But there's an awful lot of people who've disappeared over the years whose crimes have never been accounted for. And you kind of hope that a lot of those were done by Ivan Milat because at least he's been locked away. But I suspect they weren't, and that there are probably people who are equally as bad, perhaps worse, who got away with it, perhaps are still out there.
And what are your thoughts on the theories that still come up to this day that he worked with someone, that potentially the murders were perpetrated with a brother or something like that? Do you think there's any validity to those theories?
I do. Yeah.
Right.
We're somewhat limited in what we can say for legal reasons.
Yep.
But yes, I don't believe that he worked alone. A forensic anthropologist, Richard Basham, who worked with the task force, had the theory, which I agree with, that Ivan probably did the first murders by himself. He attacked onions by himself. But when it came to the Neugebauer Habschied murder, he probably had someone with him to take on the two. And then the very last murder, again, he probably had someone with him to take on the two of them. I'd contend that there probably was an accomplice at the last two murder scenes, the last four victims.
Yeah, which maybe could have been determined if the DNA had come through, but that's something that I guess it's not a possibility.
Yes, tantalising, but
yeah,
out of our reach, unfortunately.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. You have an outstanding memory because you wrote that book a while ago. And so for you to sort of be across those details, I mean, yeah, a lot of work went into that. So thank you,
Jessie.
so much.
I won't say it's been a pleasure, but it's certainly worth recording this terrible part of our history. Especially,
I think, with what looks like Ivan Milat's not going to be around for much longer, and I think that there will be sort of a resurgence in interest because I think it's a really important story to remember. It changed the way people don't hitchhike anymore. Like it really changed Australian culture in a significant way and the way that we look at tourism, and it's got a massive imprint on us, I think.
It sure did. I hitchhiked up the Hume 3 years before these murders started.
Really?
As a young fella, and you don't see them. You don't see the people out there doing it anymore, do you?
No. I grew up in an Australia where that would have just been. You just knew it implicitly that it's not what you do. Even before you knew the story, it was just sort of believed to be terrifying. So, yeah, it's an important story to tell. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a great day.
All right. Thanks, Jessie.
He has displayed the absolute worst of human nature, but I would dearly and desperately like him to help the families, in particular the ones of the murder victims who are still asking the question as to whether he's responsible. There's one particular victim, her head is missing. I think there is some real work that he could do in his last days on earth, but you're dealing with somebody who has never shown any remorse, never shown any willingness to cooperate, a complete narcissistic personality disorder where he cares really only for himself. And so the likelihood that we will get the answer is very slim, in which case I think we maintain our dignity.
You can buy Mark Whittaker and Les Kennedy's book, Sins of the Brother, via the link in our show notes or at any good bookstore. You can also listen to Mark Whittaker's 10-part true crime podcast called Blood Territory, available through Audible. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast, hosted by me, Jessie Stephens. Our senior producer and editor is Elise Cooper. If you want to discuss this episode, you can join our online community by searching True Crime Conversations on Facebook. If this podcast has brought up issues for you, you can find a full list of resources and helplines at mamamia.com.au/podcasts.